Loneliness feels like an emotion, a bad mood maybe, or a rough patch between friends. Most people treat it as something to shake off with a phone call or a night out, a temporary discomfort with no lasting weight. But the brain does not treat it that way. To the brain, chronic social isolation does not register as sadness, it registers as danger. For most of human history, being cut off from the group was not an inconvenience, it was a survival threat. No group meant no protection, no shared food, no help raising children, no one to notice if something went wrong. So, somewhere deep in human wiring, a system evolved to treat disconnection the same way it treats hunger or thirst, as a signal that something essential is missing and the body needs to act. That signal does not go away just because modern life looks safer. A person working from home, scrolling alone at night, or living far from family can trigger the same ancient alarm that once warned early humans they had been separated from the tribe. The brain does not know the difference between being alone in a city of 10 million people and being alone on an empty plain 100,000 years ago. And once that alarm switches on, it does not stay contained to mood. It starts reshaping attention, stress chemistry, even the immune system, often in ways a person never consciously notices. So the question worth asking is not whether loneliness feels bad. Most people already know that part. The real question is what it actually does, mechanically, inside the brain and body when it lingers for months or years instead of hours. Let's look at what happens and why. The system behind this starts with a single idea from social psychology. Perceived isolation triggers a threat response, not just a low mood. Here's the chain. A person's social contact drops. The brain interprets this drop as danger, the same way it would interpret a physical threat. That triggers the body's stress response, releasing cortisol and adrenaline. Elevated stress hormones sustained over weeks or months begin to wear on the body's systems, including the immune system and cardiovascular system. At the same time, something shifts cognitively. Researchers describe this as hypervigilance to social threat. A chronically lonely brain starts scanning for rejection more than connection. It becomes more likely to interpret a neutral comment as an insult, a slow reply as a snub, a quiet room as evidence of exclusion rather than simply a quiet room. This creates a loop. The more threatened someone feels socially, the more defensively they behave. And the more defensively they behave, the harder it becomes for others to get close, which deepens the isolation that started the whole cycle. Sleep is often affected too. Some researchers have linked chronic loneliness to lighter, more fragmented sleep, theorized as an ancient survival mechanism, staying more alert through the night when no one else is nearby to keep watch. The rapid-fire list of effects tends to include elevated inflammation markers, higher blood pressure, weakened immune response, disrupted sleep, increased risk of anxiety and depression, and in some studies, effects on cognitive decline in older adults. None of this requires someone to be a hermit. Perceived isolation matters more than actual headcount. A person can be surrounded by people and still register as isolated if those connections feel shallow or unsafe. Meanwhile, someone with a small circle of 2 or 3 deep relationships may show none of these effects at all. This is why researchers increasingly describe chronic loneliness less like an emotion and more like a physiological state, one with measurable effects on the body that look, in some studies, disturbingly similar to those seen in chronic stress and even long-term physical inactivity. The brain built this alarm system to keep humans safe inside the group. The problem is what happens when the alarm keeps ringing for years. One of the clearest illustrations of this comes from research done inside a very different environment, Chicago, and the long-running work of neuroscientist John Cacioppo, often credited as a founder of the modern scientific study of loneliness. Starting in the early 2000s, Cacioppo and colleagues launched a large longitudinal study tracking middle-aged and older adults over time, measuring not just how connected people said they felt, but also their blood pressure, immune markers, sleep quality, and cognitive health years later. The goal was to see whether loneliness could actually predict physical decline, not just accompany it. The findings were striking. People who scored high on loneliness measures at the start of the study showed a greater rate of physical and cognitive decline years later, even after researchers controlled for other health factors. Chronic loneliness was linked to higher risk of early mortality in later analyses pooling data across many studies, with some researchers describing its health impact as roughly comparable to smoking several cigarettes a day or to obesity in terms of overall risk contribution. Beyond the lab, similar patterns emerged during global events that forced isolation at scale. During extended pandemic lockdowns, mental health surveys across many countries recorded sharp increases in reported loneliness and anxiety, particularly among people living alone and older adults cut off from regular visits. Public health officials in several countries, including the United Kingdom, had already taken loneliness seriously enough before that point to appoint a government minister dedicated specifically to addressing it, a policy response that would have seemed unusual a generation earlier. What makes the Chicago research particularly significant is its scale and its patience. Tracking the same people over many years allowed scientists to rule out simpler explanations, showing that loneliness was not simply a symptom of poor health, but in many cases, a contributing cause of it. The human impact, stripped of statistics, looks like this: an older adult living alone, feeling forgotten, sleeping poorly, and slowly showing signs of decline that a doctor might initially mistake for aging alone, when a significant part of the picture is the absence of connection itself. There's a common assumption that physical health and social connection belong to separate categories, one measured in a clinic, the other felt in the heart. The research suggests otherwise. The body doesn't seem to distinguish cleanly between a threat to survival and the absence of belonging. Both get processed by overlapping systems, both leave measurable traces, and both, left unaddressed, compound over time. This reframes loneliness as something closer to a vital sign than a mood. Blood pressure gets checked at every doctor's visit. Cholesterol gets tracked over the years. Social connection, by comparison, rarely gets measured at all, despite evidence that its absence carries comparable weight. Perhaps the more useful shift is not to see isolation as a personal failing or a simple sadness to push through, but as a signal the body takes seriously, whether or not the mind chooses to. The brain built this alarm system a very long time ago, back when being cut off from the group could be fatal within days. That alarm never got a software update. It still rings the same way it always has in a world that looks nothing like the one it was designed for. If the topic of loneliness or isolation feels personally relevant, it can help to talk to a doctor or mental health professional, as its effects are real and well documented, not something to dismiss as simply in someone's head. If this helped you see yourself a little differently, hit subscribe. There's more where this came from.